Jason, before I do, to go to the audience, how are the worms getting on? For those who don't quite know what they were doing.
Amongst some of my more unusual business in the world, actually we have the world's largest fly factories. We built 2 this year, we're building another 3 in the next few years. And we use flies to recycle waste from landfill that would otherwise go to landfill. So we're really not getting there fast enough. By this year, end of this 2014, we'll be doing about 600 tons a day. That's 600 tons of fish we don't have to take out of our seas. And we need to be doing tens of thousands of tons a day. But we'll get there, so we're pushing hard.
And the squeamish factor?
Flies are just the cuddliest things. You can buy toy flies on the internet now. Okay, so you can buy cuddly Ebola bugs made out of as well. So, you know, maybe you have to question some people's choice. But it's amazing what you can get on the internet.
There was some debate among panel members about who got this seat here. I was very happy to take it, though.
Right. Who's first? No, sorry. Who's second? Second question. Yes, come on. Over here. Let me squeeze past. Yee. Name, please.
Charles Coves, I'm Australasia's passion provocateur. Population sustainability, a couple of propositions. Every nation on the planet with sufficient electricity has a reducing population, defined as less than 2.1 children per adult woman. So, here's the idea. Get electricity to every country in the world's population will stop rising, we will not get to 9 billion, and we will be dealing with the problem of how do we grow an economy when the population is dropping and ageing. But electricity, the numbers have been done. Every advanced nation has a reducing population, and electricity is the foundational difference.
Bjorn, you're a numbers man. Do you want to answer? Jason after that?
Well, it's very clear that electricity is part of the solution. I would argue it's also economic progress. It's the fact that you feel safe in your old age, and it's very much also about women's rights. It's both about women's education and the opportunity for women to work. And all of those will help us reduce growth rates. We're seeing this in very many parts of the world, but yes, we do want to see it in even more places. But you know, let's not forget that all of those things are not just good because we sit here in Melbourne and care about the fact that we'd rather be at 8 rather than 9 billion, but it's also really, really good for those people who are involved in it.
Jason?
I view it slightly differently. I don't think it is actually electricity. I think it's to do with urbanisation. And if you look at the birth rates in the slums and the cities around the world, they are on average 1.1 children during a female adult's lifetime. And that is because in slums and in cities, children detract from your economic activity, whereas in the countryside, they add to it. So even if you look at countries that are fast growing in terms of their populations, their urban populations are not. It's clear for me that the only effective form of contraception is not television, but cities.
Yes, please.
Yep. I'm kind of depressed about the pigs in the rivers in China. And I'm really impressed that you're trying to do something about the air quality as well. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little more about how long you think it will take to clean up your Chinese cities and how you think it will happen.
I'm sorry to depress you and right before dinner because I could go on and on about other types of depressing things that are happening. I think that it's going to take a long time because of the scale of what's happening in China. We have, over these 20 years, we're going to have 350 million more people moving into cities. And these cities are all being built at the same time. And so we have 1 Chicago of new skyscrapers being built every year, right? We have the equivalent of every single building in Canada being built in China every year, 2 billion square meters. And we're learning at the same time that this is happening because we've really only been open for 30 years. We've been urbanizing for 20, and we have a very unskilled labor force. We're desperately looking for best practices and solutions from around the world. But it's going to take time to implement them. I think we're very, very lucky in China that we have a very proactive government that is willing to put in new policies for sustainability and for things like free trade zones in Shanghai. They're willing to experiment, and they know they'll fail many times, but all they need is the few key wins to take these best practices and technologies up that S-curve very rapidly. So I think that I'm pessimistic in the short term because we have the scale of the challenges in China. But in the long term, I'm very optimistic because I think the way that China works as a multinational corporation, and because of our centralized government training, we're able to take any commercially viable technology and best practice and implement it fairly rapidly.
One more question before supper? Yes, here we are. Sorry.
This one's for Bjorn, although the rest of you can chime in as well. Because you mentioned GDP, and I just wanted to ask whether you think GDP is a very appropriate measure of progress in advanced economies. Do you not think it's just perhaps maybe a measure of how much people in advanced economies buy things they actually don't need?
There's a lot of criticism of GDP, and definitely if you look at the definition, it was never meant to be a welfare indicator. It was meant to be a national accounting measure. But if you also look at GDP as an indicator for virtually everything we like, it correlates very, very strongly. And actually, we've seen quite a, I don't know if you've followed that whole literature, there's been a lot of different sort of metrics of human quality living, that kind of thing. And it actually turns out that on most important indicators like life expectancy and health and education and many others, GDP usually wins out. So yes, there's lots and lots of wrong reasons why that shouldn't be the case, but it actually turns out to be one of the best indicators. The second part about this is also, we've always had that conversation. Back in 1900, well-off people were like, why would we need more money? We have a very, very hard time imagining what are we going to be using all that money, all that welfare for. But I'm sure if you think back, I'm pretty sure you're happy that your parents didn't say, no, we're going to stop in 1980 or 1970 or wherever that was. We actually realized that there are lots of stuff we'd like to have, so that works for the rich world, but it certainly also works for the poor part of the world who needs desperately just simply to be able to get the stuff that we think is trivial.
Anthony.
So just a general comment on this. Getting the metric right matters a huge amount. I think Jason made a very profound point when he said we have to think about what we stand for. What we stand for as individuals, what we stand for as corporations. If you ask most CEOs what their job is, they will say their job is to maximize shareholder value. This is not something that was brought down from heaven from God. The idea of maximizing shareholder value is 33 years old. It traces back to a speech Jack Welch gave in 1981 where he said, this is what I'm going to do at GE. I'm going to get out of, going to go into, and what I'm going to try to do is make as much money for shareholders as possible. That's where it came from. Jack Welch said 4 years ago, maximizing shareholder value is probably the dumbest idea in the world. So to solve some of these challenges, we need to get the metrics right. Corporations need to get them right. Governments need to get them right as well.
Before we broke, we heard that the profit motive is something which is relatively new, is that right? And
profit motive has existed for a long time. Maximizing shareholder value.
Maximizing shareholder value is something. I might actually ask Hugh Morgan what he thinks of that being a bad idea. Drew.
I think when Jack Welch first said that, the world was very different. And I think now, to maximize shareholder value, you must run a business for the stakeholders, not the shareholders. And you'll get better financial returns.
What's the difference?
It's inclusive. Shareholders are the shortest term interest group in any business. They might be there for an hour or 3 hours or 5 hours, certainly in a public company environment. So they have the shortest stake in the business. So what interest they have in the future, they don't. The people who have real interest in the future are the other stakeholders, the employees, the whole community of the business. So I think you need to run a business for the stakeholders, not for the shareholders, in order to get the best financial returns for the shareholders, because you take a longer term view.
Indeed, I'll ask you that question about whether it's individual governments in the context of, once more, The Economist magazine for this week, the man who used to walk on water. And there's Obama, with the water up to his neck, as you have noticed in the last year or so. The American system is paralysed. It can't actually do anything very much. Have you heard the noises from the Parliament across just up the street here in the last weeks, not days, weeks? It's been, for those who come from overseas, complete uproar. Nothing can be done. If you look at the new government in Canberra, with the high hopes of unleashing all this creativity, well, they've been sort of paralysed. Maybe it's early days, but it doesn't look as if government can necessarily get us prepared for the future in a way that that vote showed we should be. But what about individuals? How are individuals going to be maybe inspired to lead us in that direction? May I ask Hugh Morgan what you thought of that point, given the shareholders and the stakeholders? You know, what do you think of what you heard just before the break and reiterated just now?
Well, two things. First of all, the reference to Jack Welch. I mean, Jack Welch, I think, has gone through a major midlife crisis.
He's gone through more than one. Seems like he's gone through about 3 midlife
correct.
crises.
So I think, you know, he's got to the
Oversized.
stage where he's slagging off at profits. So I think that's a reflection of his problems. I think the last response that came from the gentleman on our right here was correct. Shareholder and profits are essential for survival of corporations, for activities. It's an accounting issue. And if you're in a company that's not making profits, you'd better watch out for your employment. But you're quite correct. Others call it a social license to operate. Having a due regard to stakeholders broadly is an essential underwriting precondition for ensuring long-term profits. So I think the word has been used in a casual manner, one which has been to denigrate those who damage their corporations or damage their outcomes by ignoring the stakeholder general contribution in the community. And so it's easy. I want to put it this way, I'm sorry. The use of profits and referring to it as being good or bad needs to be qualified in the right context. And so just using it as a single word and saying it's rubbish, that because we have profits, that's a bad word. I think somebody's got to go back and start again from 101. They've got it wrong.
Jason, do you want to answer that? Make a comment?
I couldn't agree more. I think that profitability is fundamentally important to any activity. And so many of our businesses, if they weren't profitable, would not do the good that they can do. And to think that you can ignore the nature of profitability in any activity is wrong, because it's fundamental to our survival. It allows the future to happen.
Well, can I take this from another angle and ask Bjorn a question? It comes from Joseph Schumpeter, the burning deck theory of innovation comes when we've got a real big problem on our hands, like during wartime. People did fantastic things very quickly, antibiotics in 4 years by that genius Florey and his team. They invented radar, computers, Alan Turing during the war. Any number of really important things happened terribly quickly. Can you imagine doing antibiotics in 4 years now? You couldn't get it past health and safety in 20 years. It's extraordinary. So there's everything ranging against our wanting to do something disruptive. Because, I mean, think of BlackBerry. You develop this wonderful smartphone. Everyone immediately sees it's a good idea, copy it, and you who have invested vast amounts of getting this disruptive technology to the market are suddenly left paralyzed. It's not worth it, and so you just tweak little bits gradually, stuff that you don't necessarily need. We've got all these communication toys, but we don't have what you've just seen, the winner of the scholarship, that thing which stops kerosene lamps killing millions of people around the world. Bjorn, what do you think about disruptive technology?
Well, I think there's two things there. One is, and yes, we probably can't move as fast as during wars. I'm not really sure we want to create a war just in order to move ahead. So my sense would be, look at two other things we can do something about. You pointed out how we can't do antibiotics in 4 years. And I would say that's to apart because we have become so obsessed with safety in one side, and that's the whole precautionary principle, that we've forgotten that there's another huge side. If we actually sometimes take chances, yes, bad things will happen, but good things will also happen, and we have to weigh those two. And we have become this safety-oriented culture where we're almost not willing to take any of those risks. So maybe we should open up for, maybe not do it in 4 years, but maybe in 8 years. The second part is, if you look at the shot for the moon, that was not a war. It was just simply an aspirational goal. We said, let's go to the moon by the end of this decade. And that got a lot of people thinking. I think we could do a lot of the same things if we focused our research much more. Take a page out of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation playbook. They looked at a lot of different areas, said, what are the things that we would like to see solved? And have those things, for instance, in my field of discussion for climate change, what kinds of things would we like to see solved in the next 10 years? So it's not about, large scale.
When's it going to happen, though?
Oh, God.
Gradualism.
Well, I would actually...
that is the challenge. That's the burning deck.
Let me just... one thing that I think most people missed, there was just a climate conference last week. I'm pretty sure most people
Nothing
missed
happened.
that. Nothing happened. There was one thing. Japan actually came out and said that they were not going to do their targets, which got a lot of flack. But they also said they were going to spend $110 billion on research and development into green energy. Now, remember, the global spend on research and development into green energy right now is about $10 billion a year. So they've just tripled the global green energy research and development budget. I didn't hear anyone point that out. I think that could be one of the turning points because we actually get a lot of new ideas coming out of this in the next decade.
Peggy, same thing happening in China?
I have to say, I agree with everything you've said, Robyn, except when it comes to China. So I think that the government, we can look to this government to do a lot of interesting things. I think that for great change, we need to look at pricing externalities. We need to be looking at asset disclosure. We need to look at price signals. Which ones are the right price signals? I don't know. I'm not an economist. But I do know that the government needs to be there to push great change, especially
Well, maybe
in
we
the
should
size of
change
China.
to the model of the Chinese government in Australia, do you think?
We actually have a lot of Australian leaders coming to our government leadership academies in China and trying to look at the Chinese model.
Democracy hampers great change.
Yeah.
But it also has a couple of advantages, right? I mean, we don't really want to go down that route, do we?
Yeah, but the problem, the big problem with this is that by the time a government has looked at a policy that has been tabled because the policy follows people, so the people have moved on something, then the policymakers have noticed that the people are moving on it, then it's gone through 15 committees, then it's gone up and it's gone down and it's gone left and it's gone right. The world looks very different to when they started the conversation. The problem here, I don't think, is about individuals or companies or governments. It's about the fact that the world is moving so fast and is only going to speed up that the systems that we've put in place, the command and control top-down systems, can't cope anymore.
Yeah, but Bjorn just said it isn't moving so fast.
Well, I would tend to say that our problem is that we focus on things that make us feel good rather than things that will actually do good. I mean, the Japanese argument, it's probably gone through a lot of committee. I would argue that that's probably going to be a lot better. It doesn't feel as good. That's, of course, why nobody has heard of it, because it doesn't make for a great sort of feel-good story, but it actually will do a lot of good. And I think that's a lot of the problem in many things we talk about, that we focus on the cute puppies and the panda bears, and we fail to remember the 4 million people that die from inconspicuous indoor air pollution that we don't ever see broadcast on TV.
I would agree with that because, in China, one of the greatest revolutions was one of the least sexy, which is bringing in smart grid and revolutionizing the power grid. But it's going to really open up the space for renewables. It's going to open up the space for less coal plants. It's going to open up the space for more efficiency, savings, capital expenditure savings. It's going to open up the space for distributed generation. But, who cares about the power grid?
Lots of people, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the Sydney City Council brought out a bloke called Alan Jones, with 2 L's, not that one, really to advise them is making a huge difference. It's so much more efficient. The power grids we've got are 19th century. Now, the thing I find quite amazing is so many of the things that this country holds precious is at least 100 years old. They're at least 100 years old.
And I just want to throw out a statistic comparable to what Japan is doing. Just in smart grid alone, China has this year designated 100 smart cities to test different models for smart grid, and it's committed $100 billion to deploying it. So just in that one technology alone. So I think, again, I agree with everything you said except for in China, because I think that the pace of change in China, I'm very optimistic about it.
Is China the only place that it's happening like that you would...
I think it's the only place
As a
that
model?
is innovating at a city level with every conceivable commercially viable technology.
I think Singapore might disagree with that
Oh, I'm
characterization.
sorry, yes.
So,
Yes,
certainly-
at scale.
So
Sorry,
certainly
yes.
Singapore is a lot smaller than China is, but I think Singapore poses an interesting example where you have a form of government that technically is democratic, but certainly is not really. We're tweeting now, right? So I hopefully can go back into the country after saying that. But a country that has been able to do tremendous things over the course of the past 40 years and is thinking about what can it do to compete in this world where you've got China and you've got India and you've got all these things going on in this area, and what is the unique role that it can play? And there's no place on earth that I've seen be as thoughtful about these things as Singapore.
Singapore is doing great stuff.
Jason?
I think into that, we keep on forgetting one of the biggest continents on Earth into which India, China, North Europe can fit, which is Africa. And I think it's Africa's opportunity to learn from China and Singapore and to leapfrog and not go through the messy bits that happened in the middle. So like Africa moved from no landlines to everyone having mobiles, I think this is Africa's opportunity as a continent to skip out the messy bits in the middle and get straight to the sort of smarter technologies, the smarter grids in which China and the East are leading the way.
Yeah, it's amazing. One of my favourite magazines, you might have gathered, The Economist, had a feature on Africa and showing that if you put aside the handful of basket cases, there are so many others which are doing fabulously well, which is a surprise. What's the secret of how things are moving?
Well, it's not surprising. You've got a country full of entrepreneurs. To survive on $2 a day, you've got to be a best entrepreneur going. And there's 50% of the world's youth, roughly, will live in Africa. And it's full of amazingly inventive people. They just need their time, and their time is coming.
Do you think the individuals will lead versus the government? Because in China, it's the government's leading, but I think that in Africa, it's a very different situation.
I think the people will lead much more increasingly around the world. I don't think our democracy is suited to the 21st century problems we face, other than yours. Because nobody will make the long-term decisions that are necessary to address the glaring issues we can see around us. Whereas China and, funny enough, many of the Middle East countries, not those that have undergone the revolution, realising they've got to drive change, otherwise change is going to happen to them.
Well, here's the situation. China's the model. Democracy goes. We've got to dispense with the parliaments. We've got non-functioning around the country. We've got to do various things with innovation, which possibly dispense with the profit motive. And innovation can be not tweaked, but disruptive. But how's that going to happen? Because innovation hardly occurs in Australia at all, as you heard from the Chanticleer in the
By the way, Robyn,
Financial Review.
China is not anti-democracy. It's a multinational corporation. So anybody with a business mind can really understand how China's working.
Splendid.
So, country is a multinational corporation. That's another model. Thanks, Peggy. Peter Kronborg. To you, Jason, could you bring together China and the African continent? What transformation is happening in Africa? Is there a great transformation going on? And what's the role of China that's being played there?
I think Africa is the playground of a declining American leadership and an ascending Chinese and Asian leadership. And it's very clear that China is investing heavily in Africa, in Africa's future. And most African countries and leaders appreciate that. Of course, it's making some mistakes, and but that's just part of the normal, ongoing activity. And I think China and Africa will, funnily enough, become very close.
Anyone else on that one?
So specifically, China's SOEs have invested, I think, in 7 special economic development zones in different countries. I'm sure you've heard investing heavily in infrastructure. Recently, I think there was an article about China spending a little bit more effort in anti-terrorism. I think that is the right word. But I agree, there's so many mistakes that China is making, even with the right intent. So it's really like any relationship, any marriage, it's all about continual communication and conversation and iteration and back and forth. A lot of African leaders actually, like Australia, come to China and spend a month at a time in our government leadership academies to understand the China model and see what they can bring to Africa.
Bjorn.
Well, I'm finding myself in this slightly odd situation. I'm wondering whether somebody should just stand up for democracy. I know,
That's so last century.
I know. I'm just wondering, I mean, there's two bits to this. One is there's this interesting conversation, can you more rapidly develop if you actually have less of democracy, and India is possibly a very good example of that. And I don't think I want to go into that discussion, but I think in some ways the question that we asked, could we be doing more to handle the future, is a very biased question, because obviously we can do that. I mean, in some sense, I think it's fair to say that for the last couple hundreds years, we've been muddling through. I don't think if we go back in history, we see brilliant strategies and we really did hit all the right buttons. We've kind of muddled through all the way. And we will still do that in the 21st century. And yes, it's nice to be able to say we could do even better, we could be even more prepared. But I mean, we're going to be doing pretty well, even though. And you know, I think there's a number of other benefits from democracy that's worth pointing out. Mostly the fact that we actually get to decide our own leaders, and that has universally.
We didn't quite muddle through. We had some of the biggest wars in the history of the human race.
Oh, absolutely.
Appalling stuff. Question here.
Thank you. Fiona Kerr. I'd like your opinion on the drivers, whether you're a democracy or not. So I've got experience in working in creativity and innovation in highly developed countries and also countries like Indonesia. And so from something like Finland through to Indonesia, what seems to be an issue for me, or something that's consistent with more innovative countries, is not so much the level of democracy, which tightens us up and stops us being able to kind of be, you know, flexible, but the fact that those countries are not highly litigious and they don't tend to be as risk averse. And that seems to be, in working in that area, something that really kills, you know, Australia, America, Britain, to an extent. Whereas those countries, some are very democratic and then some are not so democratic, but they're not nearly as litigious and they're not nearly as risk averse. Can you comment on that?
I mean, I would say that I think the issue here is not so much democracy or not democracy. It's about how much is government a tool of empowerment of its citizens to follow their dreams, their ambitions, and the things that they want to try and achieve in the world. Because at the moment, we're working on neo-colonial systems, or we're working on systems that have been around for 200, 300, 500 years that were designed for a very different time. They weren't designed for a time where the masses were being driven by creativity. Our education systems are the same problem. Our education systems were developed at a time where we needed a big cadre of executors
and clerks
and people to push buttons and move machines. Now what we need is a huge cadre of creative thinkers. So the systems that have got us often to where we are today are not the systems that are going to get us to where we are tomorrow. And I think that you've hit it very much on the head. If you look at what are the barriers to individuals creating their own future, the government, the level of bureaucracy, the fact that in countries like the Ukraine it takes 84 days to register a company, and then when you need to deregister a company it takes 172 days. All of those kind of things are not making it easy for people to change the world.
Can I give an example of the way in that there's a paralysis of the new technology, and paradoxically it occurred when someone about 23 years ago wanted to propose a way in which you link computers so that they could talk to each other effectively, and the guy was called Tim Berners-Lee. He wrote a proposition which he sent to his boss, and nothing happened. And he saw the boss at some function a year later and said, "Didn't you think that was a good idea?" "Oh, that sounds brilliant. Yeah, send it to me." So he simply had the same sheet of paper and changed the date and sent it up with exactly the same effect. And it was only when the boss changed that someone took Tim Berners-Lee seriously, and we got the World Wide Web. Now, where I go around to various corporations, and I wouldn't mention the ABC, would I? What you've got, compared to the 70s and even the early 80s, is a pyramid structure back to the army, you know, with the people who do the work right at the bottom. And you might see the boss via email or at farewell parties, but that's it.
Yeah.
Why is this happening?
It's happening because, I think it's happening because the single biggest driver when you're in a world of change is fear. And if you look at what's going on around us today, you've got people embracing change, people embracing the opportunities. We've got China going in all sorts of different directions. And then you've also got tribalism and fear and extremism.
It's frightening, isn't it? It really is frightening.
It is frightening. Well, you know, if you look at Maslow's pyramid hierarchy of needs. Maslow, before you get to love, belonging, and self-actualization, you have the level of security. And if you dig into what Maslow said about security, he said it was security of income, security of home, security of employment, security of family. Most of us living in Western democracies now live with 50% divorce rates. The notion of a job for life is gone. Income, who has income security? Yeah? All of those basic tenets that underpinned the ability of society to evolve a la Maslow have gone. The only thing that's left is community. That's what's replacing it.